Now live. So welcome once again, everyone. Thank you. It's been a while since our last VirtualMuleys meetup, and we want to give the chance today to the MuleSoft Engineering team that is joining us directly from Argentina. They wanted to share some topics with you, and we're going to explore that in a moment. Before we do that, we actually need to take 5 minutes to our traditional housekeeping. We're going to check some updates and the announcements. So before we start, let's remember the MuleSoft Meetup Virtual Muleys. They are organized by Manik and Sandeep in America. You have Royston in APAC and myself, Angel Alberici, here in EMEA, based in London. There is an Easter egg there in the slides for anyone following Evangelion. Yes, you spotted. Very good. With that, we're going to keep going on. These things to keep in mind. There's a few. There's 3 main things we need to keep in mind. Anything related to trainings, you can use trainings.mulesoft.com. For specific training queries, use help.learn.mulesoft.com. And for any other questions, the MuleSoft forum you can use, or as well the Stack Overflow, especially for Mule runtime questions. Make sure to pop your questions in the chat and anyone can try to answer. And remaining questions at the end of the session will be speak on your behalf. I will be asking them in your behalf. The recordings are going to be in the meetups page and also in the VirtualMuleys YouTube channel that you will get the link in a moment. And remember, for anything that you would like to see in the future, you can fill in the survey. We have a couple of topics already in the queue, but fill it in, the topics that you're interested, as specific as possible, and the value that it carries to you, and we will try to accommodate as soon as we can. With that said, the online English group, the Virtual Muleys in the YouTube channel, you can see there in the screen, and we're going to open up for something very exciting, that is the announcements. There's a lot going on from product. There's a lot going on around meetups as well. There is another meetup happening from this group on Friday. This was by Bayer. So we have Leia and Geoffrey. There was an issue in the past that the meetup had to be postponed, but it's finally happening this Friday. Apologies for the inconvenience, but for anyone interested, register this Friday. With that said, there's 4 main product updates that we can see there in the screen. The first one is around Anypoint Functional Monitoring 2.0. If you haven't checked it out, check the release notes. You will find a good surprise there. There is another one related to the accelerator for SAP. This is more specific for anyone interested in the order to cache feature. And there are 2 more, one related to Service Mesh. It's a new tutorial / blog post. You can find it there. I will share the links and to the slides and to the recordings later on. And finally, the studio news with metadata, 2 notifications for new versions of connectors, and improvements like the dark theme. A quick safe harbor statement. Please do not make business decision on what you're going to hear next. And with that said, there's the 2 biggest ones I can think of, product updates that we're getting. This for the product roadmap that is happening on 25th August is the CloudHub AWS Transit Gateway. It's not ready yet, but it's getting ready for this quarter. And the CloudHub 2.0. So if you're interested in any of those topics, tune in for the August 25 product roadmap. I will share here in the chat as well, so you have it at hand, the link, so that you can hear it directly from product. And with that, I can see the faces of Guillermo and Agustin. They're ready. There's 5 minutes in. They're based here in this beautiful continent. You can see there the lands of Argentina in the south. With that, I'm going to open up the stage for our engineering team, software engineers, both of them, Guillermo and Agustin, joining from the MuleSoft HQ, and happy to be here for the community. Thank you again, Guillermo and Agustin, for putting in the session and for reaching out to the community.
Thanks, Angel. I will go ahead and share my screen so we can have the presentation. Please let me know if you can see it.
We can see the screen, we can hear you both all right, and we can see you as well.
Great. So, hi everyone, and welcome to a new MuleSoft Meetup. Today, we will talk about Anypoint Studio 7.10, metadata definition between flows, and a new feature implemented called Custom Metadata Assistant. So let's go through our today's agenda. First, we will see some concepts and context to understand what is DataSense and metadata definition. Then we will go through Studio 6 and Studio 7 approaches. And after that, we will go through our new feature called Metadata Assistant. Then we will go through a brief demo. And after that, we will have some space for questions and answers. So let's start introducing ourselves. My name is Guillermo, and I live in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I've been working at MuleSoft since 2018 as part of the engineering team of Anypoint Studio. And I have to say that the studio might have easily been one of the most difficult and interesting projects I work on, every day giving us challenges to integrate a quite complex set of tools into an integrated development environment. But we also try to keep things as simple as possible for developers to be able to create their applications, which is indeed a challenge. So let's now introduce Agustin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Agustin. I am also from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm 25 years old, and I'm a software developer in MuleSoft as well. I joined the MuleSoft family this year in January, and I must say it's been a great experience so far to work on the development of such an amazing product because it has a lot of interesting technical business challenges because it's a product designed for developers, and developers have very high requirements, let's say. So without further introductions, I will move on to the first slide of our presentation. So first of all, we want to give you kind of an introduction to the concepts that we will be talking about today. To introduce you to these concepts, I will use a couple of examples. So let's assume that I have to make an integration of a business process inside my company. For that, I need to do three things in this case. First, I need to expose an endpoint and listen to GET requests. Second, based on that information I receive, I interact with an old database. Finally, and this is the last step, I must write the results of the operation in a file just to keep an audit in the future. In a regular context, that will imply that I need to create an application from the ground up and handle all the inherent complexity that involves. By using the Studio and with the power of DataSense, we can model the data and we can have it in our application context, avoiding that complexity. Now we have to look a little bit deeper in the next slide and disassemble this application into smaller bits to understand these concepts more clearly. So what is DataSense after all? DataSense is a key feature that helps us in the design and development of Mule applications by automatically discovering metadata based on the contents of Mule events. It also has the ability to help us with auto-completion because it knows the structure that the different operations pass to each other as Mule events because they communicate with messages. Now, let's see in detail some elements from the previous picture. We can see here on the left side that we have a select operation from the previous slide, which contains the following query in the center to the database. That query produces the output we see on the right. We expect that the query will return the records of the table. On the right, we can see that the metadata is automatically generated. But the question is, how does Studio know what the output will be? How does Studio know that we will have an order with different fields? Well, to answer that question, I'm going to exemplify this with these elements. Let's say we have a flow that I need to map attributes from, and I need to map it to a different structure. First, we have the input here as an input from the database. Now we move on to a transformation message that will adapt the structure and adapt it to the output that we require. We can see here on the right side. All that information is available to us because DataSense detects the metadata from the Mule events that components pass to each other, as I previously said, simplifying this experience for us. But what happens if DataSense is not enough to detect the types that enter or exit an operation? Well, in this case, how can I work with this, right? Well, the user is able to define this metadata manually through the Manage Metadata Type dialog we can see on the right side of the slide. And the operation output payload can be set through this dialog by adding a new type. In the right, we can see an XML schema, which was loaded from the file in the file system, and the tree is showing all the attributes on the schema and its types. After setting this metadata, it will be available for us in the next processor along the flow. Now, we move on from the introduction and the key concepts that are important for us to understand what we are talking about today here. We will discuss in a little bit the differences between the experience we have in Studio 7 and the difference with the experience we had in Studio 6. So I will be talking a little bit about the Studio 6, and Guillermo then will give you an introduction about the new metadata experience in Studio 7. So as I said, all these concepts are important to understand, and the experience and the differences. In Studio 6, the metadata will propagate between different flows automatically whenever a flow was referenced. As we can see in the picture, a flow is being referenced and the metadata is available for the user to work with. However, this experience did have some drawbacks. We can see here that we are working with multiple flows. The first flow metadata will be propagated, and it won't be possible to select which flow metadata should be propagated. We can see that the first flow propagates a Boolean, and the second one a string. However, the data that arrives to the reference flow is always a Boolean. But how can a user change this type, right? Well, unfortunately, there is no simple way to accomplish this because the first flow to appear is a flow that gets the priority for propagation. Now, after that little introduction to Studio 6, I will let Guillermo explain to you the changes that we implemented in Studio 7. Guille?
Thanks, Agustin. So let's take a look at how Studio 7 behaves regarding metadata. Metadata is not defined automatically when referencing a flow, as we can see in the input dialog marked in red. But why does this happen? Why is it just not the same as Studio 6? Well, the reason behind this is that the Studio 7 follow Mule 4 design decisions in which the declaration of metadata in reference flows has to be done manually in order to achieve a development experience more aligned with statically analyzed languages. So the user has to define the metadata contract to be able to choose which metadata arrives to a reference flow. Although this is a correct approach, it also has its drawbacks. Let's check them in the next slide. So the user is hereby enforced to define metadata manually from scratch when trying to reuse flows. Or in the worst case, just avoid using DataSense to develop the application due to the effort it implies when the data structure is too complex, as we can see in the picture. If the user was to define this type of object as metadata, then it will require to recreate the same structure and assign it as custom type. Our customers find this approach a problem when trying to migrate to Studio 7 from Studio 6, as they find this task to be too time-consuming and impractical. As you can see, this structure contains multiple nested objects and potentially a huge amount of attributes. Let's check what we did in the next slide. So we developed a new feature called Custom Metadata Assistant, which helps in setting custom metadata in a simple way by using DataSense results. This way, metadata can be defined on reference flows without the need to create structures manually. This saves time and allows us to follow MuleSoft design decisions, as metadata contracts can still be defined manually, but in a much faster and easier way. We identified 3 basic use cases and took the simplicity of Studio 6 and best practices from Studio 7. Studio 7 will assist the user in defining target flows metadata in each situation accordingly. In some scenarios, metadata definition will happen without requiring user intervention. And in other cases, the metadata will be defined through Metadata Assistant. The user can always change which metadata is defined with the help of the assistant, either before or after setting references. This leads to an easier experience and gives the ability to the advanced user to make all the required changes with less effort. Let's summarize what we have seen. First, we covered the metadata definition experience differences between Studio versions and the key concepts. Second, we explained the reason behind those differences due to design decisions. Third, we talked about the stoppers that our customers had when trying to migrate from Studio 6 to 7. And finally, we showed our new feature called Custom Metadata Assistant that takes the best of both experiences to create a new one. Next, we will go through a small demo of our feature to have a better view of what we have done.
In the meantime, guys, as Guillermo set up the demo, remember that after the demo, we will have a QA space. So any questions that you have, type it in the chat, and we will be answering them the best way we can. PJ, are you ready?
Yes. So thanks. So now we are ready for this demo. We will go through 3 scenarios that attempt to cover most of the day-to-day uses that can be done with this feature. Please have in mind that this is a sample application, which purpose is only to have a better understanding of the feature. And of course, it could be done in different ways. So with all that said, let's tell a little story about a developer named Tom, who is trying to build a very simple application, which basically processes orders. In this case, Tom is trying to make a transformation of the orders data that comes through an endpoint to persist it in a database. However, Tom also needs to persist the order information to a file on demand. The important fact here is that this information needs to have the same structure. So we can see here that we have this first flow, the database persistence, and in the second flow, the file persistence. So what can Tom do here? Here we have basically 2 approaches. He could just make the same transformation both in the first flow and in the second flow. But that could require code duplication, and it's not quite a best practice. So now what Tom can do is to extract the transform message operation from the first flow to a new flow to reuse it. So he names this flow, the generic name in this case, and here Tom has 2 options. He could either go straight forward and click OK button, but he could also set the metadata preference for our assistant. When doing this, he will be presented with 2 trees. The one in the left corresponds to the input metadata, and the one on the right corresponds to the output metadata. So Tom decides that the attributes are not required for this transformation and just decides to remove it to model this transformation. After doing this, when we go to the transform message operation, we can see that now Tom has metadata to work with. In another scenario, nothing would have been propagated. So Tom can go ahead, expand the buyer object, and map the attributes as required. So, but let's add another requirement to this application. Tom now needs to persist the operation results of the database insertion, which happens here. To do so, he created a new flow to process the data. This is the flow. So as we can see, still no reference was created. So he doesn't know what information is going through. Let's add a reference to the flow, so we can reference that flow and have this metadata. Tom would add a flow reference at the right of the logger operation in the order flow, and then assign the reference. In this case, it would be insert order results processor. After doing this and returning to the transform message operation, then we will see that now we have data to work with. So Tom would be able to make a mapping very easily. In this case, it's a very simple one. But let's go ahead in the future. Say 2 months have passed since this original requirement. So some business requirements have arisen. And Tom now needs to persist the results from the write to file operation. So in this case, he also needs to say the file name where the data is stored, which is in this case here. So what Tom can do, as he doesn't need to persist the order results anymore, he can move the flow reference to the persist order to file flow. While doing this, the reference is still the same, the one we originally set. However, we said that we needed the value of the file name, which varies by date. So we don't have it here to work with. How can then Tom work with that variable? So he could go to the flow reference, to the metadata tab, and he will find a set metadata button. When clicking this, he will be presented this dialog. This warning indicates that the metadata will be overwritten. So Tom here has 2 options also. He could either customize the metadata that is going through, just as we saw on use case 1, but in this case, he doesn't need it. So because he just needs to set the metadata that comes as input to the flow reference. So he decides to go through and clicks yes. After clicking yes, the transform message operation will have the information needed. So he can now then map the file name with the other information, which is what we needed. So basically, that concludes Tom's journey, where we can see now that the metadata that would otherwise be unavailable for modeling applications is now propagated and can be used and modified when required. So we will return to our slides to continue the presentation.
Yeah. Share my screen real quick. So after that demo that Guillermo showed to us, let me remind you guys that if you want to know more about these new changes and new features that we introduced to Studio, remember to check out the official documentation. We have documentation regarding metadata propagation between flows, propagation inside the Studio. Also, if you need a refresher regarding that we have that link available as well. And remember also, if you have any ideas or thoughts, you can check out the portal or the forum for discussions. And without further ado, let's move on to the QA time. If you have any question regarding what we showed to you, be sure to ask them in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you, Agustin, for the presentation. And actually, the live demo is always a challenge in my perspective. Thank you very much for that. With that, we're going to open, as Agustin said, with questions. If you have any questions about the session related to metadata, please pop them in the chat. It seems that whether it was very clear or we already have people working with metadata. Thank you for the feedback, Sandeep, Akirajo. Okay, Tim, I'm not sure if it's because we're in August and at least in Europe there's a lot of holidays. People are still very calm. So I'm guessing for today we're not getting any additional questions. We will leave around 5 minutes more in case anyone wants to ask. In the meanwhile, a quick plug there from the ideas portal that Agustin mentioned, as I have seen it when I was a customer. I actually opened one idea that was related to the dark theme. And I'm very happy to see that this year was actually implemented. Just as that, the transient AWS Transit Gateway, it was also started as an idea. So make sure that when you're creating an idea in the ideas portal, it's visible, and let your customer success manager or director know about it so that they can socialize it internally. We're getting a lot of good feedback from the session. Thank you all very much for that. Agustin, Guillermo, I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to add. It seems that we don't have questions for today.
I think that this topic is especially hard. It might be one of our hardest experiences because it implies working with complex structures. I say that in any case, our documentation explains a little bit more about the feature itself. Of course, we receive feedback from the users. You can share your feedback on our LMTS portal, as Agustin said. We'll be looking for this feedback to be able to also improve the experience, make it easier, and hope you find this feature useful.
Okay, Guillermo. Well, you actually generated a couple of questions here, it seems. So the first question comes from Rahul, is how can we pass custom metadata, example, first name, last name, from the flow 1 to the flow 2 that we saw in the demo?
Okay, so I think Rahul is referring to propagating certain attributes from a structure. That's not currently possible. We either propagate the complete structure or we don't in this case. That doesn't mean that it's not possible to do it. If we find that this is a very needed requirement, we could be able to add the requirements to be able to provide that. But in this case, it's only possible to propagate the metadata, either the complete payload, the complete attributes, or the complete variable structure.
Thank you for that, Guillermo. I think it was very clear and forward explanation. The second question comes from Demand. Custom Metadata Assistant. Is it available in all of the Studio 7 versions?
No, only starting from 7.10, you will have availability for the feature. Like that release.
Thank you for that. I will add it, actually, Agustin, just in case that anyone is curious to see the release notes. You can find it in the standard release notes in here. Okay, we have yet another question is, will the DataSense capability work in case that we try to call a database procedure which has complex input parameters like table type or custom types?
Yes, in that case, DataSense would try to get that information, but I like to answer this question in a more generic way because I don't have it specifically the case to know if that's happening. But in any case, if you are already seeing that, if you are working in just one flow with the database and getting that information, then you will be able to propagate that metadata to flows as it's part of this feature. But we didn't make any modifications to how DataSense currently works. So if you are not seeing that, or you are seeing that behavior won't change. However, if you find that this is not happening, you can also track this problem and make the necessary requirement, the necessary changes to fix that.
Thank you for that, Guillermo. We have another question coming from Bruce. What causes Anypoint Studio to constantly keep resolving metadata and appear to never return?
Okay, that question is something that is based on how metadata is gathered from the endpoints. There is a best effort done from the product which catches the results, so that behavior happens as less as possible. But it would depend on some basic factors. For example, maybe the endpoint that you are gathering information from might be too slow. So in that case, there is nothing you can do for a studio to work faster because it's not on that part. The problem is not there. The problem is just on the communication with the data point. So it would, I say that the answer to that question might vary depending on the context. You may have multiple communications with multiple endpoints which might be slow, and that would make that the propagation be also slow, as metadata needs to be gathered from each endpoint to be able to resolve. That I think that's one of the possible things that one has to check when working with metadata.
Thank you for that, Guillermo. Bruce, let us know if there's any subsequent question there. We don't have any more questions. Victor is adding the comment, also Anypoint DataSense behavior is different in Windows and Mac. And
well, it shouldn't be, but if in case you are seeing any difference, that's something that could be interesting to look for. Where, of course, any information regarding that would be useful for us to investigate and try to resolve the differences.
Yeah, there are some that are going to be natively and some others that if you see any behavior that is not working in one but the other, you can open up a support case as per usual. Okay, team, we don't have any more questions. Already are half an hour in. It's a beautiful Wednesday. So if there are no more doubts, I think it's time to thank you, Guillermo. Thank you, Agustin, for the great session, for the live demo, and for the community for engaging. Thank you once again. And we're going to see you soon. If you want to join us on Friday, there is another meetup coming. And that's all for today. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
I will stay in the line because I have to capture some comments. I always like to pass the good feedback.